Check, check, check. Okay, we're expecting our special guest in moments. Noel Casler is a US-based stand-up comic with a pretty neat little history that may or may not involve the 45th President of the United States. Should be a good chat. And he should be Zooming with me any moment now. By the way, if any FOTMs are listening, here comes our guest. But Friday at 6 p.m., TMLX7. Make sure you're there.
Hey, Mike, can you hear me?
Yeah, how you doing, Noel?
Good. Here, let me just make an adjustment.
Sure, man.
Test, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, there's the big mic right there.
Right on, brother.
It's funny, like, I think I've emailed you a dozen times, but we've never actually talked.
Right, I know. A lot of times. I mean, I'm like a regular every month since I think December or something. It was definitely last year.
Yeah, for sure, buddy. So this is a little different, obviously. That monthly thing obviously continues with the guys, but my jam here is a little bit different, but I think you'll dig it. You ready to dive in here?
Hell yeah, as long as the level's okay. Sounds good to you?
Well, you're loud enough. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
You want me to turn down? That's my point. This thing gets a little loud. It's super sensitive, and I speak loudly.
Well, no, because I like to control the volume here. Okay. I'm a control freak, so I'd rather you be loud, and then I can play with it. Dude. I like to play with the knobs and such.
I hear you, brother, man. That's a nice setup you got there, too, man.
Hey, thanks, man. So, yeah, I'll do a little intro, thank some sponsors, and we'll just chat. It's going to be awesome. And you can feel free to say or, segue over or whatever you want, man. If you got a good story and I'm all about storytelling, so just don't be shy.
I don't know if you're familiar with my work, but that's my jam. That's what I do, is tell stories pretty much. So,
all right, brother, here we go.
You got it.
What up, Mike? Toronto. VK on the beat. Check. I'm in Toronto, where you wanna get the city love. I'm from Toronto, where you wanna get the city love. Okay. I'm in Toronto, like we wanna get the city love. My city love me back for my city love.
Welcome to episode 884 of Toronto Mic'd, a weekly podcast about anything and everything. Proudly brought to you by Great Lakes Brewery, a fiercely independent craft brewery who believes in supporting communities, good times, and brewing amazing beer. Order online for free local home delivery in the GTA. McKay CEO Forums, the highest impact and least time-intensive peer group for over 1,200 CEOs, executives, and business owners around the world. StickerU.com. Create custom stickers, labels, tattoos, and decals for your home and your business. Palma Pasta. Enjoy the taste of fresh homemade Italian pasta and entrees from Palma Pasta in Mississauga and Oakville. Ridley Funeral Home, pillars of the community since 1921. And Mike Majeski, he's the real estate agent who's ripping up the Mimico real estate scene. Learn more at realestatelove.ca. I'm Mike from TorontoMike.com, and joining me this week is Noel Casler. Welcome, Noel.
Hey, Mike, glad to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's a pleasure. As we discussed just before I pressed the big red record button here, you and I have been corresponding via email for, I think it's been about 9 months now.
Yeah, it's been a long time. It definitely around the election, I started coming on to Humble and Fred and speaking with you. And it's great to, talk to my friends up in Toronto. I'm a big fan of all things Canadian.
All right, let's start there. Yeah, again, so much love to Humble and Fred. I'm the producer of the Humble and Fred show. And I book you as often as they'll let me, so that's pretty much been monthly, because I think your perspective and you're just great on the mic, and you're entertaining, and you're full of interesting nuggets of info. And then after 9 months of kind of hearing you on Humble and Fred, I'm like, I think the guys will let me have Noel Casler on my show and be cool with it. So thanks for saying yes to me as well.
Right on, man. Thanks for asking. I'm happy to be here.
Canada. So let's start, because of course this is Toronto Mic'd, and we look at everything from a Toronto perspective here. A little birdie told me, tell me if there's any truth to this, but a little birdie told me that you were a fan of the Tragically Hip. Could that be possible?
Oh, man. God, do I love the Tragically Hip. I forgot to put the guitar here. I have a Hofner, a 53 Hofner, that I like to think belonged to Gord Downey. I think it was one of his backup guitars, because on his solo records, he played this exact guitar. And I bought this at Kingston Guitars in Ontario before we lost Gord. But I just like to think that somebody brought it into that shop, a crew guy or somebody, and they did the neck reset. And I got it on a Jackson Browne tour. I'd been touring like hockey arenas with Jackson Browne. So we played a lot of venues that the Hip played. And I mean, you couldn't get a better band. It's amazing, just amazing. They're much more than a band, in my opinion.
Well, dude, I'm literally getting goosebumps right now, because for the record, because we haven't, even introduced you at all here, except you are American, right? Born and raised. You're bona fide American.
Yeah, I am. I'm as American as it gets. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm an American. Yeah.
Well, it fills me with pride when I hear an American like yourself, praising the Tragically Hip, because we here, as you know, we here in Canada adore the Tragically Hip. I've seen them over a dozen times in concert, and I just had Kevin Hearn on, who's actually the keyboardist for the Bare Naked Ladies. This is last week, and he was playing on The Secret Path, which was the final project that Gord Downey worked on, and he also did play on Coke Machine Glow. And anyway, so there's been a lot of Gord talk here lately. You can't see it, but to my left, it's a Chenny Wenjack print, and that was the Gord Downey, that's part of The Secret Path. But so it's exciting to me. So how did you get introduced to the Tragically Hip?
I went to drama school in New York City in the mid 90s, in the early 90s. And a lot of Canadians came down from Toronto, actually, to study acting in New York City. And one of them turned me on, because the Hip never really caught on in America. They could have been one of the biggest bands in the world. They were on par with U2 and Pearl Jam and all these other bands. For one reason or another, they never really took here, which is our loss, not theirs. But so I heard, I think when Bob Cajun came out, I think that's Phantom Power record in the 90s.
Yes.
So, yeah, when that came out, I saw a video, because for a brief time we would get Much Music down in New York Market. And I saw the video and went to school the next day and was like, I heard the best band yesterday that I've never heard of. I think they're from Canada. They're called the Tragically Hip. And of course, my buddy freaked out. And being a good Canadian, he sent me their entire catalog as a gift the next day. I had like 12 CDs in my mailbox, and I just dove in and never stopped. And, I didn't get to see them because they didn't tour here a lot. They played Woodstock 99 where I was working. And, the whole reason I took that gig was to see their performance. And I ended up missing it because I don't know if you heard, but that festival was a nightmare, and all kinds of bad things went down. So I missed their set, but I never lost the love for them. And, when Gord passed, one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen, and it's now my Christmas tradition is I watch Long Time Running, the brilliant documentary about them, because one of the things that I've always responded to in life is a public show of sort of gratitude or affection. You know, the best thing art can do is bring us together and show us our common humanity. And when they played their last concert, and I'm going to cry now just thinking about it, when they played, you know what I mean? When everybody in Canada took the day off, you know, and went outside and sang these songs that meant so much to them, you know, from the big cities all the way up into the Northern Territories, you know, small towns were making an event out of it. And everybody came together in spirit and joy. And it's one of the most, that's the height of human achievement. You know, it doesn't get better while you're alive than something like that. And what a gift to give, you know, for the man who'd given so much to his own country, you know, to stay alive, essentially to make that sacrifice to be able to do that final tour and do that. I mean, talk about a way to go out, you know, and it's just mind blowing. And also I worked in the music business for 25 years. I know how hard it is for a band to stay together that long. That in and of itself is a miracle, you know, that they stayed sort of brothers in arms the entire time, kept the same crew, essentially. That's what I love about arts, when they're organic and generic and the crew is a family, you know, and you can exist without the whims of popular culture. You know, the Hip was going to sell out a show no matter what. If they had a radio hit or not, people were going to show up to see them because it was an event. It was organic and real. It wasn't something that someone's telling you to go see, you know?
So well said. August 2016, that was the final show in Kingston, Ontario. And the whole country did shut down. And I openly wept, you know, when Gord was up there singing. I think it was Grace 2. There's a moment in Grace 2 where he's just kind of this guttural yell, and you see this man, and I was just bawling with my daughter watching that final show. Like, and even now talking to you, I got to be careful here because I could break down any moment here. But wow, that band meant so much to this country, and I'm so happy to hear this band meant something to an American like yourself.
Thanks, man. Yeah, and I know that moment you're speaking. It'll make me, I'm getting goosebumps now. You know why? Because it's the truth. You know, the greatest art always reminds us of something real. That's what you're responding to, is that you sense something in yourself, you know, and it's reflected back to you. And that means everything. I'll tell you a story real quick. Yes, you know, when I started in the business in 93, and my main career, for your listeners, is I worked behind the scenes in talent management and live television, you know, so I worked on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions and the Grammys and the VMAs and, you know, Super Bowl halftime show I did for almost 15 years, all this kind of stuff, you know. And the first gig I ever had, I was a PA on a show called the Kennedy Center Honors, which is our national arts medals, where the president gives, you know, a lifetime achievement award essentially to great artists. And I'm working on this show, and they say, here, hold this French horn and go stand out there on the stage. And I'm like, what? You know, like we're in rehearsal. They're like, we're doing camera blocking. Take this horn and go stand out there. So I grab this horn and I stand on this riser, not really knowing why I'm there. And all of a sudden, Billy Preston comes out from the left, the great keyboard, you know, B3 player with the Beatles. And then Aretha Franklin comes out from the right? And then the Washington Gospel Choir fills in next to me. And I'm like, uh-oh, you know, like something's about to go down. And she sings this gospel song, and it's amazing, right? But it ends, and the producer goes, hey, you know what? That was good, but I think you should try it like this other way. And I could see Aretha kind of bristle. Like, people don't usually tell like Aretha essentially once more with feeling, right? But this guy does. And I'm like, oh shit, it's on now, you know? So they places, everybody goes back off stage. She comes back out, and it's as if she's reaching up into the heavens and grabbing thunderbolts and just throwing them down on people, because now she's mad and she's really going to show you what she can do. And at the end of that performance, cameramen are crying, you know, these hardened grips are all crying, like everybody was moved to tears. And I was like, wow, you know, like that's amazing. I get to see that kind of stuff in this gig, you know, because I knew at night, like for the TV show, it wouldn't be exactly what I just saw. You know, I knew I had sort of had a window into a world that most don't get to see. And it fascinated me because in the greats, at certain times, you'll see things like that. Like you just said in Gord Downie, you know, he was calling on a strength that most of us don't have in that moment, you know, because he perfected his craft in a way that he knew how to channel the real stuff when he wanted to, and mostly did all the time, as many of the greats do. But Aretha gave a master class in that in this moment. And I was just like, I'm hooked. Like, I want this gig. If I can get a paycheck and watch stuff like that. And it also broadened my horizons musically, because you realize it's all good. Music, like, no matter what culture, like, you open with a great hip hop sound, it's like, it's all good, dude. If somebody's dancing to it, it means something, in any culture, any language. Like, people don't show up and dance to bad stuff. It's
right.
Like food isn't, people are always like, I don't like that kind of food. Any kind of food is good. I've traveled the world, right? If people are eating it, it probably tastes good. Even if it seems foreign to you, there's a reason they're buying it and cooking it,
Right. And I'm sure in your travels here, and we're going to get into this in a moment, but in your travels, you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. And that moment there of Aretha, that's more sublime than good, I'd say, but that's next level. But you get to witness some of these magical moments.
Absolutely. And shortly after that, say like in 2000, like 10 years in or something almost, I got to work with Bruce Springsteen, and I'd love, listen to Springsteen my whole life, sort of grew up in the New York area. Like, Springsteen and Billy Joel, like, told you your history, and that's kind of like what the hip did. They sort of meant so much to Canada because they would write about, Gord would write about these historical things that a lot of Canadians perhaps didn't even know. A lot of people, like in my generation, learn about history and culture through the artists, and so Bruce was like that for me. He sort of explained my time to me as I was coming of age. And I worked on a Springsteen tour, and the final 10 shows were at Madison Square Garden, the iconic Madison Square Garden. And it was the end of the reunion tour. So we had the E Street Band back together, and Jonathan Demme was making a film out of it, who made a film with Neil Young, another Canadian. And I worked for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young too, so we can get into that later. But
yeah, for sure.
I'll tell you about Neil Young's ranch. But anyway, so I'm working with Springsteen, and it's 10 shows. And every night during the show, there would come a point, because he'd be giving so much on stage, that I would say to myself, like, oh, he's retiring tomorrow. Like, he's going to come backstage after the show and be like, hey guys, hate to break it to you, but I have to quit. Like, I have some kind of medical condition. That was my last gig. Right. And every night I would get this feeling, and then he'd show up and do it again the next night. And I was like, how does he do that? How does he trick me in a way every night? And I'm behind the scenes, so to speak. I'm behind the curtain. I know how much of a show it is and what parts are rehearsed and how much he says the same thing every time. But he was so good at being in the moment, and that's what the greats do. They give you all of themselves. They're present. They're not thinking about their laundry list or what they're going to eat for dinner. They're giving you everything they have. And when you do that in front of an audience that responds, it creates something bigger than the band and something bigger than the audience, and that's the best of stuff.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the boss there, Bruce Springsteen, because often when you're trying to explain Gord Downie to an American who's unfamiliar with the Tragically Hip, you might say he's kind of a cross between, like, if you took a Bruce Springsteen and a Michael Stipe from REM and you sort of mash them up, that sort of get you close to a Gord Downie, possibly.
I think that's a very apt description. I mean, and Gord was a complete intellectual and a poet in a way that most weren't. Let's face it, like, he had a different level of sort of like intellectual poetry that just mind blowing. And those guys are great writers too. I'm not taking, Bruce is like Shakespeare in my opinion, but he had his own voice is what I'm trying to say. But in terms of the mold that you would put him in, exactly. It was alternative, but he also had that moral conscience, a Bono and also a great front man. I mean, obviously. I mean, but so it's just sometimes those elements come together in a certain artist, and they find the right band of brothers that can support them in that. And it just grows, it doesn't happen often, but when it does, boy, it's for the ages.
Yeah, not too bad that these high school buddies from Kingston, Ontario, just sort of worked well together, and then the rest is history. Just great. It's almost like, I don't want to compare them to those mop tops from Liverpool, but
it's exactly what I was thinking, man. And I got to tour. I was in Liverpool with Jackson Browne on a Jackson Browne tour, and he calls me up in my hotel room one night and he goes, "Hey, tomorrow, wake up at 9 a.m., call this guy. I'm going to give you his phone number and bring the band down to this address, and I wake up in the morning, I call the guy. He's like, yep, meet me at such and such in Mendips, 10 a.m. or whatever. And it's John Lennon's boyhood home. And they give us a private tour, right? So the guy like brings us in the house that John Lennon grew up in with his aunt and uncle, in Liverpool. And he shows us like Lennon's bedroom. And then he shows us this little hall, like a foyer by the front door where John and Paul first sang harmonies together. Wow. At 14. And I later worked, with CSN, and Graham Nash was friends with these guys. He met him at 16 down in Manchester. So,
okay. So before we get too far away from this, because I mentioned there's my gourd print to my left, but upstairs hanging in my hallway is a print of Neil Young. I'm a huge fan, great Canadian. Please tell me about your Neil Young experiences.
Okay, well, I got a few. I was Stephen.
I got the time if you do, buddy.
I was Stephen Still. I'm the reason Crosby, Stills, and Nash broke up, basically. We're not going to get into that now, but I was on the last tour where it all went down, and I'm basically sitting eating lunch, and Neil Young calls David Crosby and is like, it's over, dude. Like we're done, because Crosby shot his mouth off about Neil leaving his wife, who I knew and toured with, Peggy Young. And Crosby kind of said some stuff he shouldn't have said on a radio show. And that was it. We'd been trying to put together one more CSNY tour, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young.
What year is this? Are we talking about
2015.
Here? Okay. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, no, 2014 is when Neil called up and said it's done. The last CSN tour was 2015. It just, the wheels came off because a lot of reasons that involved friendships breaking up kind of, and people breaking up in long-term relationships. And it was just ugly, it's for lack of a better term, but, and Neil, obviously Neil was their guitar player and then became an equal member in the band. And, I toured a lot of that time with Stephen Stills. Like Stephen Stills and I shared a tour bus. Stephen and Neil obviously formed Buffalo Springfield together and had the same manager, the great Elliot Roberts, who founded Geffen Records with David Geffen, and Elliot Roberts management. So they had the same manager. So like sometimes it's funny, I'm playing a club in September called the Ram's Head in Annapolis, Maryland as a comedian. And the last time I was there was with Stephen Stills on a solo tour. And Stephen happened to be mad at Neil on this particular tour because Neil ended the Buffalo Springfield reunion earlier than anybody wanted, So Stills was chagrined, to say the least, and he would go on stage and like kind of badmouth Neil a little bit. And I remember walking out of that club, and my cell phone rang, and it was Elliot. He goes, no, I got Neil on the other line. Give the phone to Stephen. And Neil gave him a talking to. But Neil's a cool guy. I mean, obviously. And I got to go to the CSNY got together for the Bridge School benefit, probably in like 13, I want to say. And it was great. We spent a week together in LA, and I got to stay in the same hotel room, not same hotel room. That would be kind of weird. The same hotel, right, with Cros and with Neil Young, the Sportsman, which was a rock and roll hotel that no longer exists. But we rehearsed in like Burbank or something for a week. And I ran the teleprompter for the band too, right? Most big bands will use a teleprompter. There's no shame in it. When you have that many songs, you kind of owe it to your audience to be able to look down, and if you lose your place, when you're 70, it gets a little harder to remember stuff, so no shame in that. But I always ran that teleprompter for CSN. And when Neil came in the fold, they said, Noel, you got to run it for Neil too. And I walked into this rehearsal the first day, and his guy goes, here's 4,000 songs. Load them into your computer. And I go, okay, which ones is he going to play? And the guy looks at me and goes, he could call any one of those at any time. And I almost had a heart attack, dude. And I'm 10 feet from where Neil's playing. He's got, what's his name's old Martin, the great Hank Williams' old Martin, D45. And I'm just like, please, God, please don't call something obscure. I'd kind of like found in that database where the likely suspects were, Long May You Run, kind of. And luckily, that's all they did was the greatest hits. But I remember being terrified because Neil doesn't suffer fools lightly, as I'm sure you know. Neil is all about the art and the vibe. And if anything gets in the way of it, he'll let you know very quickly.
Wow. Oh my God. I love this, Noel. This is fantastic. Now, I'm just going to shout out a couple of people. We call them FOTM, so Friends of Toronto Mike. By the way, you are now, I think you've served enough time. You are now officially an FOTM yourself, Noel. So welcome to the club here. Brian Dunn says, love following Noel Casler on Twitter. Looking forward to this. So shout out to Brian. You're a great Twitter follower, though. And I'm going to say it off the top, and I'll say it again at the end, but it's at Casler Noel. So at CASLERNOEL to follow Noel Casler on Twitter. He's a great follow. Steve Leggett says, you have to ask Noel Casler about Stuttering John. And then Steve says, was John as annoying to work with as it seems? Can you share with us, how did you work with Stuttering John? And is there a story there?
That's funny. This guy's getting great Neil Young stories, and he wants to hear about Stuttering John. And I was about to tell you about going to Broken Arrow Ranch, but now
okay, do the Stuttering John, and I'm taking you right back to
okay.
Neil.
All right.
Good real estate here.
Not everybody gets to go to Broken Arrow, you know. So Stuttering John, I was the co-host of his show last May, not this past one, but like May of the election year, May of 20, when the pandemic started. I was on as a guest, and his producer asked me to come back every week and co-host, and I was helping him kind of like with the political guests. And, you know, we were getting a lot of political guests and stuff. And it just kind of ran its course for me. It was 2 hours twice a week, man. That's a lot of time. He was doing it live on YouTube. So we're still friends and stuff. I have a writing project I've been working on for a year. So I just had to leave and go work on my book. And now I have my own podcast. So
yeah. What's the book about that you're working on?
It's a memoir. A lot of these kind of stories, like I'm telling, you know, mixed in with stories from my life, because I had a crazy childhood and all that kind of stuff too. So it's, you know, it's sort of a memoir, you know.
And now you can tell me, please, I beg of you, the Neil Young Ranch story.
Okay, so the ranch, you know, the legendary, you know, where he recorded, you know, after the gold rush and stuff, and where they would rehearse for the 74 tour in his barn, and where Graham Nash heard the first pressing of Harvest, and he goes up there, and this is Graham's story to tell. He tells it all the time. I doubt he'll mind if I share it, but I loved it when he would tell me this story. So he goes up there, and Neil wants to play him like the first mastering of Harvest, right? So he gets to the ranch, and Neil's like, okay, get in the boat. We're going to go out in the pond, right? And Graham's like, what? He's like, get in the boat. We're going to listen on the pond, right? So we get in a boat, or they get in a boat, and he rows out into the pond, and the side one finishes, right? And the Neil had set up speakers in the house and the barn, you know, like big PA speakers that were blasting the music. So side one finishes, the engineer comes out, and he goes, Neil, how does it sound? And Neil goes, more barn. Get it? More barn, like left and right, you know, more barn. So it's like the more barn story. So when I finally get to go there, I'm like, I got to see this stuff. And I end up in his dining room with Graham, and we look out the window, and I see the pond, and I'm like, Graham, is that the pond? He's like, yep, that's the pond. Wow. But his house is like, you know, I drove there with stills, and it's sort of like, he had this big ranch. He might have, you know, it may be like no longer, because he's kind of is at a different point in his life now, but this is the ranch he had with Peggy Young and stuff. And you drive for like 40 minutes on his property before you even got anywhere, like on this little like road, you know, on the side of the Redwood Mountains. And so I'm driving, and then we get to like this field, and there's like a guy standing there with a clipboard, you know, and I roll down the window, and I'm like, hey, I'm Noel, I'm here with Stephen Stills. We're here for the party. And the guy like checks our name off a list, and he's like, okay, go park down there, you know. And we go down and park, and I look, and it was as if the hedge fund, you know, it was like if the Hobbit had a hedge fund. You know, it was like the house was like, it looked like a tree house. You know what I mean? Just like a really cool wooden, awesome house. And he had this barbecue. And I remember like going down to the basement and like running into like Tom Waits, you know, and like, yeah, like Ann Wilson came out of the bathroom. Like it was just so surreal was the best way to put it. You're just like, I can't believe I'm at a party at Neil Young's house. And I'd been to some cool places before that, but that's as rarefied as it gets in the business.
Oh my God. Like, I always wonder, like, do you ever get jaded or like just get sort of numb to celebrity because that, oh yeah, there's Ann Wilson just strolling by. Like, does it ever just become commonplace for you because you've been around them? Yeah.
It does, but not in places like that. I worked on the Grammys, so I worked with Michael Jackson. I was his escort. I worked with U2. I worked with all the boy bands, all the hip hop. So Madonna. You do get jaded in the business side of it, but when you get in these special circumstances that that not many people get to see, that's where, I did a Barack Obama's inaugurations on the mall and stuff. That's where it all becomes worth it. Like I have some crazy stories from doing that. And that is as jaded as you get, you better still have, a passion and a reverence for the music and the art and for how lucky you are to be there.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like, you keep saying you work in these gigs, like Grammys, Kennedy Center Honors, the inauguration, these massive events, but like, what exactly would you? I feel like it's a scene from the from Office Space. What would you say you do around here, Noel? Like, what is it exactly you do?
Well, it was very specific what I did. I worked in talent logistics. So I was like one of those guys who's running around with a headset, making sure the talent gets on stage. When you watch a big live show like the Tonys, which I did for 20 years, you got 200 performers, in the course of a 2-hour live event. So behind the scenes, such and such is up in her dressing room, and such is sitting in the audience, but now he's going to be giving out an award in 3 commercial breaks and stuff. So there's a team that coordinates all that stuff behind the scenes and then delivers the talent to the DGA stage managers that can't really leave the side of the stage, So I basically worked in what's called the talent department, which handles all the performers from the time they get dropped off, really from the time they get picked up in the hotel to the dressing room and all their needs and dealing with their management. So it's a very intimate kind of thing, and it's a very specialized skill. So once you get into that world, you keep getting hired because you're not going to bring in somebody who doesn't know what they're doing to handle Madonna, at the Super Bowl or something, because it's the kind of thing you can really only learn on the job, because there's a lot of like keeping your mouth shut, and smiling, and pretending like everything is going great. No, we're just running a little behind, but I'm going to get you to stage now. We got time to put on a little more makeup before you go on, kind of thing, and that's a very specific skill, and it's a very small industry. So I got in with that young, and I stayed in it until I left it, for obvious reasons when I started working, after the Trump years.
Well, I was going to say, we're going to get back to that point you just made about keeping your mouth shut. We're going to get back to that, but I'll just make a quick point about Stephen Stills before we get too distant from that. Zach, Stephen Stills, that guy worked with a couple of my heroes. He got to record, of course, with Neil Young many, many times. That's one, but he also got to record with Public Enemy because so he's doing the There's Something Happening Here riff, sample, not really a sample, I guess, if you're doing it, re-recording it, but he's doing that part on the You Got Game there by from Public Enemy, which is pretty cool. So
and that's Neil. I think the harmonic was actually Neil. That ding, that harmonic ding ding, I think that was actually Neil originally, because that was a Buffalo Springfield tune.
Right, that was a Buffalo Springfield. Yes, absolutely. For What It's Worth, that's the song.
For What It's Worth. And I woke up, Stephen, once we were in Italy and the riots were happening in the United States in Missouri. Another young black man had been killed by the cops, and there was all these days of unrest in St. Louis. And I saw it on my TV, in my hotel room in Italy. And I went to wake Steven up, and I'm like, dude, you got to wake up. You got to write a protest song, And he goes, I already wrote it. It's called Something's Happening Here. And he was like half asleep. It was pretty funny.
Great song. And if you're ever watching, it's almost like it's now when you're watching like a Vietnam movie or whatever, you're going to hear For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield. Like, you're going to hear it.
Oh, yeah. Defining song of the era. And that whole band wrote so many kind of chestnuts that defined an era. And it was wonderful, like touring with them, because, people hear that stuff and it all comes back to them,
But Crosby's got quite the reputation for being a little crusty, a little bit of a cranky pants. I mean, so I guess but what I think you would be good at to keep the job you had for so many years is adapting. Like, you must be very malleable to adapt to all different types of celebrity, because I'm sure you get the down to earth, humble celebrity who's just like, just a solid citizen and easy to work with. And then I'm sure you get what we might call like a diva or prima donna, no pun intended, but you must have to like adapt on an instant to these different personality types.
Absolutely. And that was my forte. I mean, I was basically the guy who took care of divas in live television. If you were hosting the Tony Awards or you were Madonna at the VMAs, I was generally the guy who got that assignment because I was good at handling that. I understood the first, and on the Kennedy Center Honors, I took care of Kathleen Battle on that same first show. You may not know who she was. She was an opera singer in the United States who was particularly known for being a huge diva. And I was able to completely calm her down to the point that she wrapped her arm in mine and we walked into the after party together where Bill Clinton was dancing. And the talent executives noticed and they're like, that kid's a star in this business. Hire him,
Yeah, and that's why you kept working, which is amazing. A few big names you dropped here. I have to pick them up and ask you a bit about them. But before I ask you about the names you dropped, there's a name you didn't drop, and I'm curious. Did you ever work with Prince?
Oh, yeah. I did the Super Bowl with Prince.
Oh, yeah.
I did a lot of shows with Prince, but I did the famous, crazy Purple Rain Super Bowl.
Which is, in my humble opinion, having seen all the big name ones anyways, I didn't see the the early days with like I want to call them Hooray for Everything, but that was actually the Simpsons.
Up with people.
Yes, I missed all that. But the Purple Rain, when the rain comes down and Prince is doing his performance, that's the best halftime show I've ever seen at a Super Bowl.
Oh, it is by far. I did the next like 14 out of them after that, in a row consecutively, and nothing came close. And that was because Prince, Prince is one of those guys. There's nobody else like Prince. Like, what a loss. You're not replacing a Prince. A Prince comes along, like a Miles Davis comes along, like a Mozart. Like, you don't replace a talent like that. And I loved Prince. Purple Rain came out when I was 14. I saw it in the movie theater. It was mind blowing to me because I was a kid who grew up idolizing Hendrix, and back then I was named after Jimi Hendrix's bass player, Noel Redding, and I lived in Woodstock a lot as a kid with my father. And so Prince was the guy to come along and sort of like take the mantle from Hendrix, and if you remember, music was somewhat segregated back then. Like if you were a white kid, you listened to Van Halen and Rush, and if you were a black guy, you listened to Michael Jackson and, Rick James or whatever it is. And Prince seemed to come along and like kick ass on the guitar as much as Eddie Van Halen, but also bring in a funk, awesome, like melodic thing. And that's what you need. It's what I was saying at the top of the show. Like, you want music to bring everybody together and be so excellent that everybody's going to smile and get in on the game,
An unbelievable talent, but were you allowed to look Prince in the eyes?
Yeah. Well, you want to hear some stories about that stuff? I got friends who were out to dinner with him, and like he would talk through another person. Like she'd be like, "Tell Prince I like his hair," and they would tell an intermediary, and then that intermediary would tell Prince. So he did have those strange things. The first gig I ever did with him, he had a cardboard box, and like if you take a cardboard box, it's got 4 sides. They'd cut off 2 sides, and there was a security guard just holding both sides of the cardboard box in front of Prince in the green room so nobody could look at him. And I'm like, who's that? And they're like, that's Prince. I'm like, why has this guy got a cardboard box? But I have a feeling that Prince did a lot of that stuff just to get over on people. He had like a devilish personality, because if you think about how he lived in Minnesota. He didn't live on like a Star Trip kind of thing. Like he had his own compound, but he would drive around Minneapolis and like go into bars and listen to music at First Avenue, 10 years ago, as a big star. So he was as much, nobody's ever going to accuse Prince of being a regular guy, but he didn't live that Star Trip, if that makes any sense in a way. And I'll go back to the Super Bowl, and I did the Rock Hall stuff. I did cool things with Prince, and obviously that guitar solo is probably the greatest guitar solo ever. And that's a great example of what I'm talking about. Like he's on stage with all these other dudes and everybody's like, oh no, oh no, whatever that was, I'm not following that. And Prince was humble about that. He just said, my friend Jeff Young was the keyboard player in that jam. He plays with Jackson Browne, and it was, Tom Petty and all these guys. And Prince was like, nope, let everybody else, have 12, 16 bars and I'll just hop in at the end, and he just casually walked on stage and just tore it down. He could have done that at the beginning, and taken the first 16 bars and then walked off and made everyone else look stupid. But he didn't. He still served the song. Do you know what I mean? And that's who Prince is. And I'll give you an example. When we did the Super Bowl, I was in charge of the FMU marching band, which was a Florida University traditional African American, HBCU college's marching band, which was a kick-ass marching band, like one of the greatest marching bands in the country. The brass and the drums and all that. And their director, Prince, got in touch with their director 3 weeks before they were going to perform on the Super Bowl. They played on Purple Rain, if I'm correct, and worked out the chart with him, went over every note that these guys were going to play. Like, Prince took the time to make sure that the marching band was going to have the most kick-ass arrangement they possibly could for the performance, and then he shared the moment with them. We had them all in these neon things. And I remember being on the field and it was raining sideways, as and guys are slipping around with their tubas and stuff, and stuff's flying everywhere. And Prince is there with his guitar, playing that solo. And originally he didn't even want to do it because we always do a safety tape on the Thursday night. And when they first heard about the rain, I was told that they were like, hey, just run the tape. And people are like, we can't run the tape. It was sunny out on Thursday. Nobody's going to believe that. And then when Prince got word of it, he was like, well, then make it rain harder. So he's a baller, that.
Wow. Literally, because as Charlie Murphy told us, he was a hell of a basketball player.
Yeah, he was. He played on his high school basketball team, and I'm 5'7", right? I'm a short guy. I got a basketball hoop out in the backyard. I couldn't imagine he would play in his heels. He had a basketball court in his house in LA, and I think in Paisley Park too. And when he got frustrated in rehearsals or mad at somebody, he'd make them go down on the basketball court, and then he'd just drop 3-pointers over them, until their ego disappeared.
And he'd make you pancakes. If I'm trying to remember the Chappelle story, but yeah, amazing. So that's Prince. Okay. But again, for the record, you were able to look him in the eyes. I just didn't want to bury that lead there.
I didn't get any of that Star Trip. I never talked direct. A lot of the people I worked directly with, Prince, as I said, I was in charge of the FMU marching band and stuff. So I was never hey, time, I don't remember that. I remember kind of getting him out of the trailer to go to stage with a bunch of other people. And I've been with those people who tell you not to look at them. I could name you some pop stars that have people walk in front of them and say such and such is coming through. Turn your head and don't look at them. And Michael Jackson, I had to do that for. I had to block down the hallway to bring him to stage at the VMAs in 2001 at Lincoln Center. And unfortunately, I had to tell U2, Larry Mullen, that he couldn't go back to his dressing room. And he didn't realize why for 5 minutes. And then Michael Jackson crossed by and he goes, mate, is that the reason I couldn't go to my dressing room? And I'm like, yep. And he's like, oh my God, I can't believe he pulls this stuff. We would never do that,
Glad to hear Larry say that, because I always remember this, the Brit Awards, and there was Michael Jackson was performing one of his typical, I can't remember, Earth Song or something, but it's he was doing this Christ-like pose, Jesus Christ pose kind of deal. And Jarvis Cocker from Pulp rushed the stage. He couldn't stomach it anymore. I always like it when these reasonable artists are can we stop entertaining this bullshit here?
Yeah. Dude, I'm with you on that. And I've noticed that usually, generally the cool guys are down to earth. And I've studied this stuff, obviously, since I've been in the business. And I have theories on that. Like you mentioned Crosby. Crosby is a crusty kind of guy and can be a bit of entitled. Crosby grew up rich in Beverly Hills. His father was an Academy Award winning cinematographer, whereas you get the guys that grew up in England, your Graham Nashes, who's as down to earth as possible. Paul McCartney, who I've worked with. Paul McCartney is as down to earth as you're going to get, because these guys grew up in England after the war. They were broke. They were still getting rationed and didn't have food and all this stuff, where America obviously completely prospered after the war because we built all the things. So then we had this industrial sort of infrastructure that made all these kids sort of rich. So the boomers that grew up in America, when they became rock stars, became entitled adolescents. And the British guys are hey, I'm not working in a coal mine. This is awesome. I'm just going to be normal. And if anybody had a right to be arrogant, it would be somebody like Graham Nash, because the guy was in, the Hollies. Like, he first met the Beatles when they were called the Silver Beatles. He used to ride around in cars with the Beatles. Brian Jones would ride in his car because he didn't like Mick and Keith. The Stones, they would all be on these package tours. And here's this guy 50 years later, and every venue we'd walk in Ohio or whatever, he'd stop to the security guard and say, "Hi, my name's Graham. How you doing?" You know what I mean? Where these other guys, like, you try to ask them for a picture and they tell you to F off,
I love hearing stories like that. And for the listenership, the FOTMs who are listening and like, hey, are you going to ever mention the 45th president of the United States? I'll just say that is coming, but I'm really digging this music chat here. Madonna. What can you tell me about working with Madonna?
That's one I should plead the fifth on. I've done a lot of stuff with Madonna, man. I've done a lot of things with Madonna. Fill in the, whatever your imagination tells you is probably true. I don't hate Madonna. It's Madonna. Like, she is that kind of creation. She is somebody where it is kind of a big public image thing, and it's an empire, and it's a big, she's not the most talented singer in the world. I think that's obvious to everybody, and you have to guard that. And that becomes, a lot of what I notice is that people that aren't supernaturally talented try to make up for it in diva-ish behavior. They hire people to sort of throw their weight around. And the last time I worked with Madonna was at the VMAs, probably in 2017. I came in to do a couple shows after I sort of left the business, and I was in charge of her. And, she was fine to me, but it was the same thing. I couldn't let anybody ride in the elevator with her, and I had to shut down everything. And I will tell you this, generally, it's like their publicists and their managers that kind of make your life hell more than the actual artist. There's a lot of people that justify their jobs by making sure everything is perfect, and there's some level you need of that, but, if you're a big star, especially nowadays, you need a security team, and you need to be able to get in and out of the building sort of unobstructed. There's no shame in that, but there's a way to do it with a really low footprint. And the ones I admire, U2 is like, you won't even notice when they come in and out of the building, and they're very secure, and they got a whole team of guys, or Springsteen or somebody, but there's a way to do it without attracting attention to yourself. And that's not Madonna's way. Madonna's way is like, pull the car up sideways in front of the stage door, make sure everybody knows I'm coming. And then I'll pretend like I don't want to say hi to anybody when I walk in the room,
Now, you mentioned you to keep that gig for so long, you've got to know how to keep a secret or two, because what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, I suppose. But I'm curious, what if you witness something illegal? And I'm not talking like, smoking cannabis, and that's not allowed. I'm not talking that kind of illegal. But if you see anything untoward, illegal, and immoral, would you report that? Or I'm just...
Oh, without a doubt. And if I had known some of the things I know now about our former president, when I was doing the beauty pageants, you saw things that were untoward, and disgusting and misogynistic, but that was the business. That wasn't just Donald Trump. That's how people behaved. I came up in the industry when it was these awful people. And obviously I saw Trump snorting Adderall and stuff. I didn't know then he was becoming president. You know what I mean? So abusing drugs isn't like,
right.
That's part of the gig too. I've seen a gazillion guys, I worked with Lemmy, from Motorhead, like he had to snort lines, or meth before he went on and performed, and more power to him. And between the two of those guys, Trump was the bigger speed freak. He did more speed than the guy who named his band Motorhead. So, and Lemmy was a cool guy, no diss to Lemmy, but the Trump stuff, people did sign NDAs to protect the image that they created on Celebrity Apprentice. And that was the image of a billionaire, and it benefited the Russian government and whoever wanted to sort of destabilize the US to have a bunch of people in red states believing this guy was a decisive decision maker and a billionaire who was married to a supermodel. In reality, he was a 70-year-old drug addict who wore Depends because he was incontinent from years of stimulant abuse. He painted himself orange. He wore a girdle. He wore shoe lifts. He couldn't read. He's dyslexic, so any word more than 3 syllables, he couldn't read off a cue card, and he'd storm off set, snort more Adderall because it made him feel in control, like he knew what he was reading. He'd come back on, stumble through the thing, and he'd leave. Okay, you'd get maybe an hour a day out of the guy. He didn't decide who got hired or fired. Only if it was a person of color, he would say, no way. It's got to be a white guy who wins. And he would use the N-word and all that. So all of that stuff was hidden. But at the time you're participating in it, you're like, it's a show. It's all fake. It's like Madonna can't sing, but nobody really knows that. She's had a 40-year career, like it's a product, and people get paid in that product, not just the guy who's the figurehead, but the company that puts it on the air, the advertisers that sell advertising, guys like me, so crew guys, so it was sort of okay to have an NDA and this kind of stuff until he ran for president. And once he ran for president, I called up my colleagues and was like, dude, this guy's a maniac. And this guy's an active addict. And I want to make a distinction here because I'm not judging. Like, if you can do drugs and do the gig, more power to you. Like if you're functional, I got no problem with it. The point I'm trying to say is real addiction is dysfunction, right? You only think about yourself. You live in self-centered fear. You're writhing in, resentment all the time. This story came out today. He wanted to find out who leaked that he went into the bunker last summer during the protest in Lafayette Park and have them executed. He literally said that to Mark. And that's the guy we knew, right? So I called up my colleagues in 16. It's like, look, this guy's a maniac. If he wins, he'll destroy this country. And most of my colleagues are like, he's not going to win and you'll never work again if you say anything. And I said, look, if he wins, there's no industry anyway, because he'll screw this country up so bad it'll shut down. And sadly, I was right? There was no production in the last year and a half. There was no TV shows. There was no concert tours, because when he was faced with his first real challenge, which was the coronavirus epidemic, all he could think about was his own political fortunes, right? And he didn't lock it down right away. And then when he did, he was like, I'm not wearing a mask. You can wear one, I guess, and he hid all the PPE equipment, and doled it out to red states and instead of Democratic states. Like, he couldn't have handled that worse. And it ended up killing 600,000 of my fellow countrymen. It ended up losing a year and a half of American progress. Like, we're talking about culture and stuff. We lost a year and a half of culture. Right? Nothing happened last year. We sat around and watched The Lion, Tiger King or whatever on Netflix. You know what I mean? There was no great tours. There was no Broadway plays. There was nothing that moves the ball forward in terms of progress for humanity, because we let a drug addict in charge. And now, in many ways, he's more powerful than ever in the United States. He just had a CPAC rally on Sunday. Like, he's literally the front runner for the next presidential election. That's insane. That's uncharted territory. We've never faced a challenge like that as a nation. And the only thing that'll free us from that is the truth.
There's a lot to process there, Noel. Holy smokes. Okay, so there we are talking Trump, and I knew it was coming. And I know you mentioned earlier about, keeping the secrets. That's how you keep yourself employed in that industry. And then you've mentioned NDAs. So now that you're speaking so openly and honestly about your experiences with Donald Trump on both, again, not just Celebrity Apprentice, but on Miss Teen Universe? Is that the okay? Have you ever received any?
It was two shows. Sorry to cut you off. It's Miss Universe and then Miss Teen USA, both of which are horrible ideas. Giving that kind of pageant to Donald Trump. Imagine the first guy to pitch that. Like, here's the deal. We're going to get the hottest 15-year-old in every state, fly him to Atlantic City, put him in a bikini, and let Donald Trump and his friends tell us which one is the hottest. You know what I mean? Like, that was the gig. And he used it like his personal playground. He would inspect the contestants. He'd line them up and stick his fingers in their mouth and check their teeth and stuff. It literally stopped production so he could basically like manhandle these women.
And you've actually witnessed this. Okay. Wow. Okay. So you haven't received any kind of lawyer notices about the fact you're spilling a lot of tea here? Any reminders about the NDA? Any threats of any action against you for talking about this?
Not really. I mean, I get death threats all the time, but that's what he's done to half the country. I had a lady write me yesterday on Facebook, I can't wait till they shoot you.
Oh my God. Yeah. Do you ever think, because think about it, you just really articulately described one of the greatest cons in the history of your country, that so many, Republicans have bought into this portrayal of Donald Trump as some kind of like savior, demagogue, like that same person who would believe all that and would think, you know, the COVID-19 vaccination is a hoax and all these things are dangerous. The same person who believes all that is somebody you would, I believe, would be dangerous, like would potentially do something stupid, like we saw in early January, the insurrection. Like, are you at all, like, you must be at least a little bit afraid for your security.
I'm not, I'm not a fool. I understand it's dangerous. I just don't feel like I have a choice. I don't feel like there's anything on the other side of this. January 6th is a perfect example. These guys are nuts. In the last week in my country on the 4th of July, just because a hotel worker let herself into a room to clean a room, she found a loaded long rifle, an AR-15, 5 high, volume magazines, and a loaded handgun pointed down onto a park where a 4th of July celebration was going to be happening the next day. Then later in the week, on Friday, at the NBA, MLB All-Star game, the baseball All-Star game in Denver, they found the same thing in another hotel room, but it was 4 guys with 10,000 rounds of ammo. Okay, so Trump has built an army. There's an army of the ignorant now that is being manipulated by, like you said, the GOP and these forces. Trump was the perfect beast to sort of stimulate these ignorant masses, right? Because he's dumb, he's inarticulate, but he comes out at these rallies and he waves a flag, and all the rubes can be like, hey, look, it's the guy from TV, he's just like us, and it's very psychologically powerful because it's always about, and Fox News makes it 10 times worse, right? So these people are being fed poison and anger and fear 24/7 to the point like he got them to not wear masks. That's insane. These people aren't taking the vaccine. You're not taking a vaccine. You'd rather die alone in a hallway, choking to death because your lungs are filling with fluid, but that kind of psychological warfare is dangerous and powerful. So yeah, I may be scared for myself, but I'm certainly not the kind of person who's going to keep my mouth shut. If there's anything worth fighting for in life, it's this, the future of our country. Not to mention these idiots are standing in the way of like dealing with the climate crisis. You in Canada, in Vancouver, it was 118 degrees 2 days in a row 2 weeks ago. Like, that's insane. We're all going to die unless we fight this and unless we understand the forces behind it. Fox News is owned by, an Australian dude who lives in London. Okay. He doesn't have the best interests of the United States at heart. Governor Abbott, who just put out a $10,000 bounty on any woman who gets an abortion in the state of Texas. If a citizen turns in a woman who has an abortion, they get $10,000 per the Texas governor right now. The Texas Democratic reps had to fly to DC last night to prevent voter restriction laws from being, enacted in Texas, from taking away the right to votes from minorities. So this is a war for the soul of our country. And it's being waged by these ignorant people, at the behest of hucksters like Trump. But the forces behind it are people like the Koch brothers, big oil interests, big people who benefit from a dumb politic, from a body politic that doesn't have critical thinking, that doesn't pay attention to humanities. Reagan came into my country and took out all the arts funding. There's a reason for that. It's like what we were discussing at the beginning of a show. If people understand art and beauty and music, they understand there aren't that many differences between each other, right? And all of this kind of conservative politics is about exploiting differences and making the other the enemy. And whenever you do that, it's cynical and it's for a purpose, but it's not a good purpose and it never ends well.
Wow. Now, if you're looking for hope, though, at least, if we just look at metrics here, which are the only undeniable truth, I suppose we have. Biden beat Trump by a greater margin than Trump beat Hillary. Like, that is a fact that sensible people do not dispute. Because I realize that's a whole hot button issue in your country right now. But that does give you hope that this con man he has his loyalists, but they're theoretically there's not enough of them to give him another term in the White House.
Well, I hate to rain on your parade. You are correct in what you said, but that's in the popular vote. But my country gets determined by the Electoral College. And Trump came within 88,000 votes of pulling off another electoral college victory. So he could have lost, the popular vote and still named himself president.
Sure.
And that's what they're trying to prevent now. That's why in Georgia and Texas, they're basically like, we're going to make sure this never happens again. We're essentially not going to let African Americans vote next time, and that's what's scary, is that these secretaries of states in all these countries and all these Republican states now are running and appointing themselves to office, and they're just going to overturn the next results where you do have a democratically elected person. They're going to say, nope, we ain't certifying those votes. We're sending Trump. And that's a real fear, and there is hope. I'm not trying to be unhopeful, but we also, and it falls on people like me to be extra scary and cynical because I'm a comedian. So it comes natural, but
yeah, you got to be diligent because you're basically you're at war fighting for democracy here in your homeland. But you mentioned you're a stand-up comic now. So when do you go from being, and I'm going to get back to Celebrity Apprentice because I got a few more questions there, but where do you go from being what you were in the industry to stand-up? Like, were you always stand-up comic on the side? And you just tell me.
I went to drama school in New York. I went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, as I mentioned earlier, with a bunch of Canadians. And I always did a lot of comedic plays. So sort of comedic acting came naturally to me. I did a lot of improv after I got out of school. Like I took classes at UCB, Upright Citizens Brigade. So I always, like, even when I wanted to be serious, people were laughing at me, And when I was a kid, my sense of humor was how I survived, because I lived in a pretty rough kind of multi-ethnic neighborhood as a little kid, and I was a little like white kid, So how I survived was.
Where was this? Because I've heard the Howard Stern talks about growing up in Roosevelt, and he kind of shares his experience.
Yeah. This was outside of DC in the 70s. So basically Washington, DC, in the 70s, sort of, in the aftermath of those race riots and that kind of upheaval. And, a sense of humor was how you survived. We had tough circumstances, but we all kind of stuck together, and you'd sit around and kind of make fun of each other because you were poor and, and you had struggles. But it also developed empathy, and I was always the new kid. My mom moved around a lot. So that was how I sort of made friends and stood out, was being funny. And then when 2016 happened, I knew I was kind of done in the industry. I wanted to talk about it. I'd written protest songs. I'd always written songs and stuff, but I felt instinctually that music couldn't speak to the moment in a way comedy could now, right? Because stuff was happening so quickly. By the time you wrote a song or put together an album, you were going to be 10 tragedies down the road, like this, right? And I have kind of a quick wit in dealing with that stuff. So like I did a stand-up set. I talked about this stuff about Trump that we're talking about now. A friend of mine, Kathy Griffin, and actually a Canadian, Mike Smith, one of my best buddies. He's Bubbles in Trailer Park Boys.
Of course.
Right.
A musician in his own right, of course, because Curious by Sandbox is a great jam.
Exactly. And Mike had, he had the hip, and they did a video with the hip. Yeah. Yes, so, we met, I could tell you, Trailer Park Boys stories. We've done stuff in Amsterdam and Nova Scotia, and they're good buddies of mine in the music interest. Cause I would have like the Trailer Park Boys sit in with Jackson Browne, like when we played in Halifax and things like that. I had them sit in with CSN in Amsterdam and on the last tour ever. And it was kind of a disaster. And Crosby refused to participate and everything. It was crazy. But anyway, they were down in New York doing a show at the Beacon Theater because they do a Christmas tour that's really popular. And I went by and we're hanging out backstage after the show. And I said, I'm doing stand-up now talking about this Trump stuff because I just want to get it out there. And it's also cathartic for me to talk about it and make people laugh, but kind of warn them like, hey, you better watch this guy because the dude I know would blow up the world without a second thought. And Mike goes, send me a video, So I sent him a clip. And I remember it, it was early December of 2018. And I sent him the clip and he goes, hey, can I put this out on Twitter? And I go, yeah, but let me set up a Twitter account first, because I didn't even have Twitter. I was like, let me get Twitter first in case I ever come to Toronto. Maybe I'll get a few followers. And he put it out and I woke up in the morning And Mike had texted me like a million times. My phone was blowing up. And he's like, dude, McCartney's people just put it out. Kathy Griffin retweeted it. Tom Arnold retweeted it. And it went viral. It had like 4 million views in a few days. And, now I have 300 something thousand Twitter followers. And, and I started using that platform because, as I was saying, stuff is happening. So I like to speak on it, and comedy is a good way to do that. And by no means is everything I say meant to be funny. I'm basically trying to make you laugh every once in a while. I'm really trying to make you think.
Right. And I will give you this. I'll give you more than just this. In fact, if you were here, I'd be giving you beer and pasta and all this great stuff for being on Toronto Mike. But I will tell you that you are an excellent communicator. So just listening to you in the cans here for the last hour, you are a gifted communicator. So if you have if you're naturally funny and you're quick-witted and you're a good communicator, and you're the only person I know who's kind of who would know who's talking about the fact that Donald Trump wears diapers. That's
You could see it though. Like, don't even take my word for it. If you're skeptical out there and you're listening, do a Google search. And I don't mean like the fake video or picture of him on the golf course with the dirty pants. Look at the outline in his pants. You can clearly see the outline of an undergarment and, an adult diaper. And I'm not trying to make fun of people that are incontinent, because every time I talk about it on Twitter, like incontinent Twitter gets mad at me. Like, it's not funny, man. Like, I'm not, I'm sure I'll be wearing them someday.
Right.
There's no shame in the game, right? What I'm talking about is a side effect from drug addiction and a guy who didn't share his medical records with you. The first thing he did when he was elected was he sent Keith Schiller and Matthew Calamari, his 2 security guys, to his doctor's office. They knocked the guy out of the way, Harold Bornstein, who was a Dr. Feelgood on the Upper East Side, who supplied him with Adderall and Valium and also half the Upper East Side. He supplied. He lives near me. He died mysteriously in January. But 4 years ago, Trump pushed him, or 5 years ago, Trump had his guys push him aside and stole his medical records, right? He did that not because he wants to hide that he's got high blood pressure. Trust me, So I'm trying to point out, like, the guy has an active, psychological medical condition, addiction. And it's not something to fool with. It's just one of his many maladies. He's a narcissist and a psychopath. He's literally, no joking, no hyperbole, he's the most damaged person I've ever met or seen.
Okay, let's go back. So, Celebrity Apprentice, did you work closely with Donald Trump on the Celebrity Apprentice when you were working there?
I was Ivanka's handler. Ivanka was the one I worked most closely with. Donald was right there, but as I said, he would only, and I did Celebrity Apprentice finales. I wasn't there like day in, day out on the taping. Like, no offense, but that was way beneath my position in the industry. I did it when celebrities came in and we did these live shows on NBC. So we'd have Joan Rivers and, Cyndi Lauper and all these other people would join us for these finales. And I did what I explained earlier. We would deal with the logistics, moving everybody around. But even in doing that, 1 or 2 days a year for 6 seasons, I saw enough crazy behavior. You can imagine what the people saw that were in there day in and day out. And don't speak out now because they don't want Mark Burnett to sue them. But to answer your question, I was Ivanka's handler, and she's even scarier than he is. I know Ivanka and Jared, and they were around the whole time, and they're the ones that are really running the show behind the scenes. Okay, they're the sort of like brains behind the empire. Trump wants music to play when he walks into a room. He wants to get high, and he wants to hit on women. Do you know what I'm saying? He wants to fill that hole inside of himself in the moment. He doesn't have a big long game. It's all about base needs. Addiction is like desire run amok. So Trump can only think about what's going to make him feel better. That's why he has these rallies all the time, because he needs people cheering for him. He needs constant reassurance. Those other guys are a little slicker. They can play the long game and kind of stay behind the scenes, and manipulate it and pull the strings. And honestly, that's what you have to fear, because Trump has created this thing that has allowed like all these other, Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Lauren Boeberts and all these people to just say these keywords now and get instantly really popular within that party. But if you get somebody like a Ron DeSantis, as a president, somebody with some self-discipline and a little more smarts than Trump, it's game over for the United States. Game over.
Wow. Is there anything specific? So other than, so Ivanka's just pulling the strings, like in The Godfather, like the marionette?
Like manipulating her father, like that soft, breathy voice. That's all made up because he likes to hear her talk that way. Her real voice is low and she curses like a sailor. You can look up an old clip of her on Conan O'Brien and she's using her regular voice. So she would use that around her father to sort of assuage him and manipulate him. She's his sexual ideal. As crazy as that sounds, he would ask what she was wearing when she got to set. When I did those pageants, he would pick out all the girls that looked like Ivanka. He would bring Ivanka as his date to events when she was like 10 and 11 and 12 years old in New York City. I'm sure your people have seen all those pictures. He behaved with her in a way that most fathers would not feel comfortable behaving with their daughter. And you've heard him on Howard Stern talking about how great her breasts are and how he'd be sleeping with her if she wasn't his kid. So she knew that, you know what I mean? And she knew she could sort of manipulate him and then step aside, and his desire, so to speak, would be foisted on another innocent woman, in his purview. And she played that game with him, and she'll continue to play it, because when it hits the fan, she still has sort of cards to play. She could play the victim card and say, I was scared of my father. I was just going along with it. Because, these cases that are against him in New York, they're against the Trump org and they're money laundering. And she was in the middle of all that. She was running the company too. She was the figurehead of the company when they would do these deals like in Toronto. They had a failed deal up in Toronto. It was Ivanka that they send up there to pretend like she's going to buy a condo in the building and she's going to be moving in too. And if you buy a condo, she might just be stopping by your house to borrow a cup of sugar. She was sort of the disciplined, polished, pretty face of the later Trump organization grifts, where they did Trump Baja, Trump Soho, Trump Azerbaijan, Trump Moscow. I mean, it was a corrupt criminal organization on an international scale.
And did you have any insight into Donald Trump's relationship with Melania?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they hate each other. They hate each other. They would show up separately. They never would talk to each other. I was told they were going to get divorced before he got, elected. And then once he was elected, she couldn't divorce him. So she had to go to DC. But she hates him. They all hate him. The kids hate each other. Don and Ivanka, pardon me, Don Jr. and Ivanka hate each other. It's like a den of vipers, the whole family. But yeah, Melania was, she was an escort. She was his escort in New York City. And then he married her because she looked like this Italian woman that he had a big crush on that he couldn't ever get any attention from.
Wow, the whole dynamic. I mean, Succession is coming back to HBO, but they have nothing on this Trump family. I mean, this is...
Dude, the Trump family is Game of Thrones, and that's what I would tell people. It's like Game of Thrones, and you only know the half of it. You have a kind of a lighthearted show, so I'm not going to get into all the Epstein stuff and all that, but Trump's a bad dude who, if his name wasn't on the side of buildings in New York City, and if he wasn't a wealthy man, whether he's fake wealthy or not, he's more wealthy than most people, right? Mm-hmm. So he got away with stuff that nobody else would get away from, get away with.
And without a doubt, my perspective here, again, speaking from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Donald Trump must be the greatest overachiever in the history of the world.
Absolutely. The guy has failed upwards his whole life, right? He was a millionaire by the time he was 11 months old because his dad would cheat on his taxes and bury all his money, his assets in his children. So he'd give them property and their names and all this stuff. So by the time Trump's, 3 years old, he's a multimillionaire. He works for his father. Then he starts, and his father basically builds for, the Genovese crime family in New York, right? So then Trump goes into the casino business. They all fail, right? The old man dies. Trump forces his siblings to sign away, their rights to his father's empire, which is a real estate empire in New York City. Like, you shouldn't sell that. You keep that forever. It's always going to make money for you, right? But Trump takes a one-time payment of like $736 million, then blows that. He uses that to bail out his casinos. It doesn't work. He's broke again. NBC puts him on a TV show, a game show, essentially, where he can't even read cue cards. Right. And he makes that a success, and then he gets elected president, right? And now he's twice impeached president who presided over the biggest disaster in American history, and he's still got a 70% approval rating, and he's grifting people every day.
Wow. Okay. Well said there. Yeah, absolute overachiever. But does he have some intelligence that he's able to fall upwards, as you say? Like, is he at all like a smart guy?
No, he's the most unread, stupid person I've ever met. But he's constantly underestimated. And here's the mistake people make. They sort of think, well, he's too stupid for that. He's not stupid in the sense of being a predator. Do you know what I'm saying? He always knows how to look out at his own best interest. If you listen to the tapes that have come out about him, like Bob Woodward released some tapes when they were talking about the coronavirus, or Lev Parnas released a tape when they were talking about Ambassador Yanukovych, I always get her name wrong, over in Ukraine. And Trump goes, take her out, get her out of there. They said, hey, this ambassador is standing in the way of us kind of getting dirt on Biden. We're trying to do this corrupt thing. And he's like, take her out, get her out. And when he's talking to Woodward, he's got his self-interest at heart. The thing that people don't get about Trump is it's an act. Like, he doesn't care that you're laughing at him. Okay. He doesn't want to be humiliated in the sense that, like, sneaking into the bunker and you think he's a coward, but he doesn't care about you making fun of his hair. He knows his hair looks stupid. He knows he's painted orange. That's a costume, and it's an effective thing because it disarms people. When you hear him behind the scenes, he's on it. Like, people like to say he's got dementia. He does not have dementia. Okay. He knows where he is all the time, and he knows exactly what he needs in any given situation. And it's all he thinks about. And again, that's what I was warning people about. That's not what you want in a president. You want a president who's going to think about himself last. You want a Barack Obama or somebody who's like, whatever's best for the people, that's what I'm here to do. It's not about me. That's the ultimate it's not about me job.
Okay, you mentioned Barack Obama. So I thought maybe, because I need to process this and cleanse this whole Trump talk, which, by the way, I appreciate your candidness and sharing all that. That's amazing. And we are going to talk about your podcast and the tour and everything. But can you share with me any stories at all from the inauguration for Barack Obama?
Yeah, man, that was one of the most special days. I mean, that was a day where it all came to fruition. I'd been in the business probably almost 20 years, and I'm back in DC, I'm doing this thing. And we did a big concert on the Mall the Sunday before he was inaugurated on the Tuesday. And it was on HBO, and we had Springsteen and, Pete Seeger, who I'd known, most of my life, and, U2 performed, and all these like incredible bands, Stevie Wonder and everybody. And Barack at the end was like, hey, I want to meet everybody. So we all went in this little tent and got selfies with Barack Obama. But while the event was going on, I was standing just below where President-elect Obama was sitting with his beautiful family, and I'm standing there, and I noticed on one side of me is Sharon Stone. I'm like, oh my God, it's Sharon Stone,
Sure, yeah.
And it's like, whoa, wait. And then I looked to the left of me because I wanted to tell like another dude next to me, like, yo, bro, Basic Instinct over here, And I look next to me, and it's David Axelrod. And if your people don't know, David Axelrod was the campaign manager for Barack Obama, So I see it's David, and, I just say, hey, man, I'd like to thank you for your role in this. Thank you for helping make this happen. And he puts his arm around me, and he goes, turn around. And I'm like, what? And he's like, turn around. And he turns me around to face the mall, and he goes, I didn't do it. They did. And he pointed out at 2 million people that were lined up in 10-degree weather as far as the eye could see to see our nation's first African-American president take his place in history. Right?
What a contrast from what we've been talking about the last half an hour. In terms of class and dignity and intelligence and thoughtfulness, what a complete juxtaposition with
Exactly. No, and you could feel it, like I was talking about at the top of the show, that feeling, when the hit played there, it was like everybody became one. And there's no better feeling as a human than being a part of a community. That's what we all search for. We all that's what family is. That's what holidays are. We're trying to all feel like we're together in this and we have each other's back. That's what love is. It's a big celebration of joy, and you felt it. So when he said that, I was like, oh my God, like I got to step away, So I sort of step off to the side just to collect myself, because I'm like, I'm about to start crying in front of Sharon Stone. Like I gotta catch myself, dude. So I step over to the side, and I'm sort of standing there breathing, trying to take it all in. And my friend Danny Clinch comes over. Danny Clinch is a very famous rock photographer. He photographs Pearl Jam and Neil Young. He's Neil Young's like main photographer. You've known his work if you don't know his name. Pearl Jam, directs their videos. So Danny happens by and sees me standing there. And like Danny's known, he carries this little Rolex camera around his, hangs around his neck. And he sees me and he's going to take my picture, right? So he lifts up the camera to take my picture, and I give a peace sign, right? And U2's playing, Barack's behind me. I give this peace sign, and Danny starts like shaking the camera and moving around. And I'm like, what's happening? And finally I take it down. I go, Danny, what happened? He goes, dude, when you were given that peace sign, Bono saw it, came over, took the peace sign from you and gave it out to the 4 million people. And I'm like, no way. Yeah.
What a life, Noel. Honestly, what a life. And does Bono, does he wear lifts in his shoes? Because I heard that once. Do we know? Does he wear
could. I didn't notice it. I've done, more than a few gigs with them. Bono's a cool guy, man. Like I never noticed.
Funny, I was at a Pearl Jam show here in Toronto once where Bono went on stage to sing Neil Young's Rockin' in the Free World with Eddie Vedder.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was amazing. And I love all fantastic here. Brother, I could talk several hours with you. So much ground to cover. Please tell me about the Noel Casler podcast.
All right. So the Noel Casler podcast is a weekly podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It comes out on Monday. It's basically like what you just heard here on this wonderful podcast. It's just me ranting, talking about the week's events politically, and I pepper in some of those stories. And, I got some live shows coming up. I'm going to be at the Rams Head in Annapolis, Maryland, September 16th. And tickets go on sale tomorrow for a theater show in Norwalk, Connecticut at the Wall Street Theater on November 18th. And you can find me on Twitter and just, Google me. I'm out there.
Are you calling this your unverified tour?
I am. The unverified tour. How do you like that?
Okay, that's because I always wonder, because I should preface this by saying I'm talking about Twitter Canada right now, and I make all the operations run out of California, which is not Twitter Canada. But I'm very tight with the director of communications at Twitter Canada. Like, if they were to verify you, would that like fuck up your marketing plan here?
Yeah, well, then I'd switch the name to the no edit button, the no edit feature tour.
No edit fee. That's right. I think they're working on that too. But again, at Casler Noel, you've got the podcast, Noel Casler podcast. And I'd be remiss if I didn't tell people that I've got you on Humble and Fred next week. So you'll be talking to more Canucks before you know it.
Looking forward to it. I always have a blast in the morning with those guys.
They're legends here. Dude, that was just a legendary debut on Toronto Mike. I got to say, I really appreciate it. You kicked ass, you took names, and love talking about all those stories, but I think what I loved the most was talking about the Tragically Hip with you. That was amazing.
I agree, brother. Thank you. Any chance I ever get to talk about the Hip with a Canadian who knew them, I always take it.
And that brings us to the end of our 884th show. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Toronto Mike. Noel, again, he's at Casler Noel on Twitter. Our friends at Great Lakes Brewery, they're at Great Lakes Beer. McKay CEO Forums, they're at McKay CEO Forums. Palma Pasta's at Palma Pasta. Sticker U is at Sticker U. Ridley Funeral Home, they're at Ridley FH. And Mike Majeski is on Instagram at Majeski Group Homes. See you all next week.
This podcast has been produced by TMDS and accelerated by Roam Phone. Roam Phone brings you the most reliable virtual phone service to run your business and protect your home number from unwanted calls. Visit roamphone.ca to get started.
No, buddy, that was tremendous, man. I really enjoyed that.
Awesome, dude. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, man.
I'm here when you need me. I don't know if you'd ever need me, but if you ever need a guy who knows people here in this city, let me know. But thanks again for your time. I'll tweet it at you in like 15 minutes. I'm going to drop this in 15, so I'll tweet
Perfect,
it.
Dude. I'll retweet it. I'll send it out to my people, man.
Amazing, buddy. Thanks again. That was awesome.
You have a good one, brother. I'll
care,
talk
buddy.
to you on email, man.
Yeah, I'll see you on email. See you, buddy.
Bye.